Thank you. I think I'm unmuted, right? It's a delight to be here. I've enjoyed so many of the webinars from Future Church. And so it really is an honor to be part of that with you. I'm going to share my screen and do a very primitive slide deck. So I hope that you will enjoy some of the pictures as well as some of what I share with you in the way of findings from my research. Tonight's talk is really focusing on the 19th century history, and the one on April 26th, which is coming up in a few weeks, will focus on current events and current activity of sisters in the United States. So I just want you to understand that this is really the historical background, and the contemporary concerns will be more the focus of the second part of this little mini series. So I've always wanted to be part of a mini series. So anyway, let me share my screen and get started. So I'm assuming that everybody can see what I'm showing. And if not, somebody please shout at me because I can't see any of you.
We can see it, Peggy.
Okay, good. Okay. So I want to start at the beginning with the first community of sisters in what's now the United States, the Ursuline Sisters who came to New Orleans in 1727. And according to this is really interesting. If any of you are Ursulines or know the history of the Ursulines, you know that they were founded by St. Angela Merici to be primarily a teaching order. But they were brought to New Orleans to open a hospital. And this, it seems to me, is a perfect example of how sisters who came to the United States or who organized here and were founded here were innovative in what they did and how it related to their own particular traditions. So according to the Treaty of the Company of the Indies with the Ursulines, what they signed before they left France, it was only when the religious can do so conveniently would they be encouraged to take in girl boarders and open a school. Instead, as I said, they were brought here to open a hospital, which they had absolutely no experience doing. We know most of their early history from letters that one of the novices who traveled to the New World wrote home to her father, Sister St. Stanislas Hachai, who wrote to her father shortly after the sisters were settled. She said, "You see, my dear father, that we are not useless in this country. We are determined not to spare ourselves in anything that will be for the greater glory of God. As teachers, soon to be nurses, servants of the poor and orphans, and benefactors of what she called fallen women, the small band of sisters, quote, discharge at the same time the functions of 4 different communities, that of the Ursulines, which is our first and principal one, that of the hospital sisters, the Sisters of St. Joseph, and those of the refuge." Within a couple of years of their arrival, the sisters became embroiled in tensions and power struggles between the Jesuits and the Franciscan fathers who were active in the area, as well as with officials of the Company of the Indies. And when these men threatened to control and determine the lives of these women, their superior, Mother Duchemin, simply said, if you don't want us to be who we are, and if you don't want us to do what our rule says we are allowed to do, we will simply leave and go to the Caribbean. With that threat, because their usefulness had already been proven, the Ursulines were allowed to choose their own confessor, to organize their own ministries, and basically to be left alone in their internal affairs. So they may be the first order of sisters in what is now the United States, but they were hardly unusual in this story. In nearly all respects, their story foreshadows so much of what we become, the common experiences of American sisters. Adjustments to new and often difficult circumstances, assumptions of diverse and often unforeseen ministries, entanglement in both ecclesial and civil politics, and unexpected challenges to their autonomy and congregational integrity. Most importantly, it reveals both the commitment and the agency that sisters exercised, especially notable in an era when women were notable for neither. To be sure, such experiences were not unique to either America or the New World, but they manifested themselves so regularly in this environment as to be not only representative, but typical. For the first time in modern Western history, women's religious life would evolve and even flourish in a context where Catholics were neither privileged nor a majority of the population. Furthermore, unlike the European experience, there would be no tradition of cloister or contemplation as being normative for vowed women. Nearly all sisters in this new setting were engaged in active works, teaching, nursing, and what later would be known as social work. Finally, from at least 1820 on, sisters would outnumber priests in the United States. So here, to summarize, are these contrasts. They were mostly active rather than contemplative. They were multi-ethnic in most cases rather than mono-ethnic. Each community oftentimes would admit sisters from 2, 3, 4 or more ethnic and national backgrounds. They were more numerous from the very outset than priests and brothers. And what this means, and I don't want to underestimate the significance of this, the majority of people in full-time professional ministry in the American Catholic Church have always been women. So when you think about ministry in the Catholic Church of the United States, you should think about women. And this helped to define what Catholicism meant, not only for Catholics, but for non-Catholics, who were always beneficiaries of what these sisters did. Now, this didn't happen without problems or without controversy or conflict. The Racine Dominicans came to this country and settled in Racine, Wisconsin in the mid-1870s. And shortly after they came here, actually in the 1860s, but in the 1870s, Mother Hyacintha Oberbrunner, who was their superior, wrote in her diary 3 days before Christmas. "No Holy Communion today," she wrote. "Father didn't give it to us because we were not good. Father didn't give it to us because we were not good." What Mother Hyacintha reflects is a kind of tension and a kind of controversy, some examples of which I'll be talking about tonight, that showed how sisters were objects of control and of discipline, often through the use or the deprivation of the sacraments from various clerics who understood that sisters were, in many respects, far more popular, far more welcome, and far more active as ministers of Catholicism than they were as ministers of the sacraments. So that's going to be a kind of an underlying theme of what I talk about today. Sisters were also not the plaster statues, and those of you who are sisters know this well. We're not the plaster statues and the kind of saintly and benign figures that people were often led to believe that women in habits represented. At least 2 founders of American communities were unwed mothers. Maria Anna, Mother Mary Frances Boll Bachman, founder of the Philadelphia Franciscans, later married her children's father, but she had at least 2 or 3 of her children before their wedding. Another unwed mother was Mother Ardelia Berger, founder of the Sisters of St. Mary, now part of the Franciscan Sisters of Mary, in St. Louis, Missouri, a nursing community. And they were holy women, but they were very human women. Several of the founders of American communities were separated or divorced. Mother Antonia Herb, founder of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Mother Cornelia Connolly, founder of the Sisters of the Holy Child Jesus, was divorced from a husband who later sued her in British court for resumption of conjugal rights when he, after being ordained to the Catholic priesthood, decided that he no longer wanted to be a priest and he'd rather be married to her. He lost that suit. And she, of course, is now venerable and her community still thrives and prospers. Mother Veronica Starr, who was the founder of the Religious of the Divine Compassion in Westchester County, New York. And Mother Alfonso Lathrop, the daughter of Nathaniel Hawthorne, Rose Hawthorne, whose husband and she were both converts to Catholicism, and they were separated. It's never clear whether they were actually divorced, but after his death, she founded the Servants of Relief for Incurable Cancer. So all of these women were people who lived very human, very mainstream lives, and nonetheless, these aspects of their experience are often obscured or blotted out because it doesn't seem to fit the stereotype of what holy women are supposed to be. And I find that rather amusing, as well as really frustrating. Other women, of course, were canonized and seem on the surface to have lived very kind of holy and uncontroversial lives. But Mother St. Theodore Guerin, founder of the Sisters of Providence in St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana, spent some of her early time in the United States under interdict by Bishop de la Allandière, who later would have to resign from his role as Bishop of Vincennes, Indiana. It's pretty well known now, although it wasn't at the time, that he was mentally ill. But he put her under interdict because she was a strong, assertive woman who was interested in protecting the spiritual and the ministerial integrity of her young community. He wrote, "Bishops have the power to inflict public chastisement to maintain their right and the unity of ministry. The church has granted to them to punish the priest as well as the layman if they disregard their duties and oppose their orders. A bishop has the right to suspend, to interdict, or to excommunicate according to the difference of the crimes and the obstinacy of the guilty." And in that, he was writing to Mother St. Theodore and Mother Theodore, and obviously the judgment of history is very different, as he is pretty much forgotten and she is regarded as a saint. At least 2 antebellum founders, and we heard about one of these communities in a recent webinar from Future Church, were women of color. One was born to a mother who was an unmarried consort. That's Henriette de Lisle. Henriette de Lisle was destined, along with her co-founders of the Sisters of the Holy Family, in New Orleans, to become the mistress of a wealthy white man, as her mother had been. And instead of doing that, many of these women, by the way, once they were too old to be considered physically attractive to the men who they were sleeping with, were just cast out with no support, no resources, and were left to fend for themselves. So the first ministry of the Sisters of the Holy Family, founded by Henriette and her three companions was to open the Alfond nursing home in New Orleans, which is today the longest continuously operating nursing home in the United States, or at least it was until Hurricane Katrina. And their first clients, the first people they took care of, were often their mothers who had been cast out and cast aside. Mary Lang was one of four women of color who founded the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore, a community that, like the Sisters, the Holy Family, is still thriving. And she is now being considered for canonization, as is Henriette. And again, when I first started doing my research, and I realized that there were two communities of women religious in the United States, made up of women of color, in the slave states, in states where enslavement was legal and common. And yet they founded communities of women religious. I found this really, really remarkable. One story that we didn't hear from Diane Batts-Morrow's fascinating talk, because she was talking about a more recent period of time, month or two ago, is that the bishop and the priests of Baltimore, excuse me, I do not know what happened. The bishops and the priests of Baltimore were refusing to offer ministry to these sisters out of pure racism. And among other things, they discouraged young boys from serving as altar servers for the Oblate Sisters in their convent. And so during Holy Week in the 1830s, the sisters trained their students, their Black young women, to serve the altar so that there could be liturgies during Holy Week. So I think it is kind of a fascinating aside that the first female altar servers in the United States were young women of color trained by the Oblate Sisters of Providence. A third woman of color, also born to a single mother, who was one of the four founders of the Oblates, later left the Oblates and was founder of three more communities and member of four. She is Theresa Maxis Duchemin, who founded the IHM Sisters, first of Monroe, Michigan. Then she was the founder of the communities in Immaculata and in Scranton. And she spent 18 years in exile when the bishops refused to acknowledge her and allow her to lead the community she had founded. She went into exile with the Grey Nuns of Ottawa, Canada, where she lived for 18 years until finally Archbishop Wood of Philadelphia died, and she was able to move back to Philadelphia, and she spent the last 7 years of her life with the IHM Sisters of Philadelphia, and she is buried in their property. She wasn't the only woman to be deposed and exiled from her congregation. One of my favorite sisters is Mother St. Andrew Feltin, who was the founder of the Sisters of Divine Providence in San Antonio, Texas. Mother St. Andrew was trying to protect the rights of her sisters, largely through not forcing them to do things like the laundry and the cooking for the priests in the parishes where they taught, and not counting the collections and this and that. And so he excommunicated her, he put the community under discipline, and then he just deposed her from leadership. This was after he separated them from their sisters in Alsace-Lorraine. He said the sisters in Texas wanted to be independent. He told the sisters in Texas that the sisters in Alsace wanted to get rid of them. And this was so he could exercise his control over the community in Texas. Later, this was discovered to have been entirely his own doing. Finally, Mother St. Andrew, in fighting back, was deposed. He went to the sisters. The bishop went to the sisters, Bishop Naraz, and announced that she could no longer be the leader of the community and that they needed to elect somebody new. For the first 3 ballots of the new election, these sisters who had been, there were only about 15 of them, they had been in the country for less than 20 years. On the first 3 ballots, they unanimously reelected Mother St. Andrew. This was to let him know that they were in charge of who their leadership was going to be, not him. Finally, Mother St. Andrew went to them and said, look, the bishop's never going to leave us alone if you don't elect somebody else. So they asked her, okay, who should we elect? Who should be a replacement? And she said, I think you should elect Mother Florence. Mother Florence wasn't even in the country. She was recruiting new sisters back in Europe. And when she arrived back in San Antonio, she was met at the station by a friendly priest with her little band of postulants. And she said, I hear there was an election. Who was elected? And he said, you were. And Mother Florence would be head of the community for many years. She was an excellent leader. And she eventually, once Bishop Naraz died, again, after 18 years, there's some magic to that number, she was able to welcome Mother St. Andrew back to the community where she lived for a few more years before she died. These are women who are exercising control over their own identity, their own reality. When Mother St. Andrew left Texas to go live with her married brother in California, she was accompanied by another sister named Sister Racine. Sister Racine, very soon after, returned to Alsace and re-entered the community. She was renamed. She was renamed Sister Camille. A few years later, she would be one of the founding sisters of the Sisters of Divine Providence's new mission to the United States in Kentucky. And they obviously wouldn't have chosen her as one of their founders if they didn't have enormous trust in her. So regardless of the bishops kicking them out of the community and threatening them with all kinds of things, the sisters recognized their tremendous fidelity. I didn't realize how powerful this was until I saw the record of Sister Camille's death in the archives of the Sisters of Divine Providence in Melbourne, Kentucky. In the necrology, both of her religious names were listed, and she was identified as having served several years in the Texas missions before being sent to Texas. Although the bishops regarded her as having been dismissed from religious life, the congregation never did. And although it was understood by the sisters in Texas that there had been no contact between the communities until Vatican II, I found records of 3 visits that Mother Florence made to Melbourne, Kentucky over the course of her lifetime, and was really happy to be able to share that information with the sisters in San Antonio. Another sister who was put under interdict, indeed her whole community were the Sisters of Loretto in Narragansett, Kentucky. They were put under interdict by Bishop William McCloskey, who at the time of his death in 1909 was the longest serving American bishop. He served for 40 years, and he managed to make life miserable, not only for most of the religious communities in his diocese, but also for large numbers of the priests. Some communities simply withdrew from what is now the Louisville Archdiocese, including the School Sisters of Notre Dame. And one community of Franciscans who had been founded there simply moved to Iowa because they wanted nothing to do with him anymore. The situation got so bad that when he put them under interdict, the abbot of Gethsemane Abbey, the abbey where later Thomas Merton would live, went to Washington to meet with the papal nuncio to get the interdict lifted, which he did. And we know all about this because the abbot wrote 3 letters to Mother Praxedes telling her about what he had done and why he had done it, and that she had the support of the papal nuncio. When Bishop McCloskey died, Mother Praxedes went to the funeral, sat in the front row, and one of the other sisters recorded in the annals said, entitled the entry, "Our beloved bishop's last dig," meaning his grave was being dug. And she concluded by noting that before another November comes, our dear bishop and exerciser is dead. And Mother General Praxedes is one of the chief mourners at his funeral. Obviously, she was mourning quite enthusiastically. So these are some of the kinds of experiences that sisters had. I want to tell one story because it's probably unfamiliar to almost all of you. And it's really fascinating. And I want to tell this one because it's a story of a relatively small community, the Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon. And most people don't know their story. Most people don't know they exist. In the 1860s, there was a precious blood priest named Albrecht in Ohio. And he was something of a charismatic leader. And he was also a very, very strict and rigid man. And there were a number of people who liked his kind of legalistic leadership, and they followed him. He was eventually kicked out of the Precious Blood Fathers. And they followed him out of Ohio, originally to Wisconsin, then to Minnesota, where there was a group of women and men, families, and their daughters who formed their own religious community under his leadership. It did not have a name. They still thought of themselves as Sisters of the Precious Blood because they didn't know they'd been kicked out. And finally, when they reached Minnesota, the priest died. And the community was taken over by 3 married laymen who said they didn't need the sacraments. They didn't need a priest. They simply needed to pray to the spirit of Father Charles. Eventually, the bishops of Minnesota found out what was going on, kicked them out of Minnesota. They had been preserving his body in a coffin that they kept in the rafters. It's a very strange story. And they took the coffin illegally to Oregon, and they settled in rural Oregon. Now, at the time they left Ohio, a little 8-year-old girl went with them, and her name was Emma Bliley. Emma Bliley kept a diary from the time she was a small child. And this is how we know this whole story. Eventually, when they got to Oregon, she was a teenager. And for some reason, and it's not clear how or why, she knew that something was very wrong. And one day she encountered 2 Benedictine priests from Mount Angel Monastery in Oregon. She told them the story of what had happened over the course of now more than a decade. They told Archbishop Gross, who's pictured here, and he came to the community and he announced that they were not an official Catholic community. In fact, they had all been excommunicated years before. But that if those who thought of themselves as sisters wanted to form themselves into a religious congregation under his protection, they were welcome to do so. And so the people literally were asked to make a choice. And a group of the sisters chose to become the Diocesan Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon. Eventually, they elected Emma, now Sister Wilhelmina, as their first Reverend Mother. But the bishop decided they needed a completely new start, and so he deposed her as well. And she lived the rest of her life in obscurity. Her diary was stuck in a corner of the attic, and it was not rediscovered until after Vatican II, when they moved to and built a new mother house. And they found this diary with an account of their early years. They thought that they were a religious community founded in Oregon by this bishop. And for some reason, they wore their crucifix on a red cord because they had devotion to the precious blood, although they didn't know why. That was their, of course, original religious identity. The story of Mother Wilhelmina and the story of this whole journey was finally told in a history of the community published for their centennial in 1886. But even now, if you look at their website, there's a little bit of ambiguity about Mother Wilhelmina's role. She was an early sister, but she was not credited with being a founder. Instead, the bishop was. So these things keep, going on and on and on. There's so many of these stories. One of my favorite stories is that of Father Peter Giroux. Father Peter Giroux is somebody nobody's probably ever heard of today. He was quite notorious in his time. It turns out he was an alcoholic. He was in many ways a brilliant man, but a very troubled one. He brought suit against his own diocese, the Diocese of Baker, Oregon. He brought suit against several religious congregations. And I found records of at least 5 religious communities having worked with him. And 4 of them, of course, eventually left his parish because he was absolutely impossible. So he alienated the Mission San Jose Dominicans, the IHM Sisters of Scranton, Pennsylvania, the Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon, who we just heard about, and the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary in Oregon. He obviously, after a while, could not find any sisters in his vicinity. And so he invited some Philadelphia Glen Riddle Franciscans to minister in his parish and in his school. And the sisters were sent. He insisted on charging the 5 pioneer Franciscan sisters for what he said was their welcoming meal. He required that they open an academy in which they would teach a variety of subjects they were ill-equipped to offer, including physics, and demanded that they teach teenage boys, which their constitution prohibited. Because the brothers who had been working there were also alienated by Father Peter Giroux, and they left, and he couldn't find replacements. A short time after they got settled, Father Giroux went to the sisters one day in their convent and said, I just want to say goodbye. I'll be back. And they said, oh, of course. And then he was gone for like weeks. And the sisters didn't know what to do. So they wrote to Reverend Mother back in Philadelphia, Reverend Mother Agnes, and they asked her how to proceed because they had no priest. And she responded that they should attend Mass at the next parish. They wrote back and informed her that the next parish was 90 miles away and not convenient for regular worship. This is in the 1880s or 1890s. Besides, they wrote, there have been several robberies on the stagecoach between here and there in recent weeks, and we are reluctant to expose ourselves to such dangers. So the sisters decided that they had to take responsibility for their own spirituality. And they concluded that some worship was better than none. And so they began to attend the Methodist Church in Baker, Oregon, in the absence of the priest. And I thought that was a really creative strategy and also a really early example of ecumenism on the part of Catholic sisters. They were able to exercise such freedom in part because they were so far removed from their mother house, and they were so far removed from any other Catholic influences. But I think they were a remarkable example, and Franciscans from Glen Riddle are still active in the state of Oregon due to these remarkable pioneering women. I could go on and on and on, but I want to make sure that we have time for discussion and for questions. Mother Mary Austin Carroll was a pioneering sister of mercy in the United States. And aside from being the founding superior of several foundations of mercies throughout the South, she wrote the 4-volume Leaves of the Annals of the Sisters of Mercy. She was a trained historian, and the volume 3 has been incredibly valuable to me because that's the volume that tells the story of the mercies in the United States in the 19th century. She was a legendary sister, a legendary educator, a legendary leader, and yet she also had many run-ins with Catholic prelates that she had to deal with. Most notoriously, Bishop Francis Xavier Leray, who was first Bishop of Natchitoches in Mississippi, and then later Archbishop of New Orleans. And when she would write about him to some of her sister friends, she would simply refer to him in her letter. She wouldn't use his name. She simply referred to him as the miserable man who wears the mitre. And everybody presumably knew who she was. And her biographer loved that line. And she told me, although she never gave me the letter, and nobody can find it in the Mercy archives, that she also wrote in another letter, which the biographer claims to have seen, that she would write to them and say, "He is a terrible man, and I fear he is insane." Now, I wish I could find the documentation for that, but she swears she saw that. Now, I don't want you to think that all of the controversy and all of the tensions within religious life happened only between clerics and sisters. Sometimes it happened among the sisters themselves. I want to give you 2 examples of that, both because I think they're funny, but then to make a larger point. The School Sisters of St. Francis in Milwaukee were a German community, and one of their early superiors was Mother Alfond Schmidt. And like many superiors, she wrote circular letters to all the local houses with spiritual teachings, but also disciplinary messages. And I'm especially fond of a letter that she wrote to all the local houses of her community in November of 1922. I will read you part of the letter. "A number of abuses, which may not in any way be tolerated, have crept into community. Sisters walk around in the house, sit around, and study in their kimonos. In the strictest way, I forbid all sisters to wear their kimonos anywhere except in their bedrooms. Another religious irregularity is that sisters use powder, rouge, cosmetics, and lipstick. For God's sake, how far will worldly-minded sisters go? Truly, I fear for such sisters. If the sisters will not overcome temptations to vanity in this life, how will they overcome the temptation of the devil at the hour of death? With all the power of my office, I forbid every sister, without exception, to use rouge to color eyebrows, lips, or cheeks. I would never have believed that such a command would ever have to be given, but unfortunately, that is the case today. That is the spirit of the world. Woe to the religious who falls victim to this spirit. What won't you sisters try?" So apparently not all the flappers were in speakeasies. Some of them were apparently in the convent. When I was doing research at the archives of the Franciscan Sisters of Dubuque, Iowa, I discovered, while I was there, the archivist said she wanted to show me the heritage room, the little museum. And so during lunch one day, she went in to make sure it was dusted. And when I came back to the archives after lunch, she was all excited. She had this manila envelope in her hand. And she said, "I found this manila envelope in the heritage room. Let's open it together." And it turned out it was a collection of responses to a survey that had been sent in the early 1920s to all the members of the community as they were revising their customary in light of the publication of the Code of Canon Law in 1917. And so we don't have a copy of the survey, but we have a copy of the answers, and we can figure out a lot of the questions. And most of the answers were, we need to have more time to get ready in the morning. We need to have more than one alarm clock in the house. We need to be allowed to talk at lunch because silent meals aren't helpful before we go back into the classroom. There were all these kinds of things. But then there was this one letter. It was 2 or 3 pages long, and it was written by Sister Egidia Seibert, who was born in 1863, entered the community in 1878, and died in 1947. And the archivist I met in the 1980s actually knew Sister Egidia when the archivist was a novice. And Sister Egidia wrote a 3-page letter, which I will not read to you, but it is fairly remarkable, sharing her complaints about the community, about how there was a small circle of sisters who kept sharing the leadership and passing around superiorships from one to another, how none of the sisters were taught what canon law was all about, so they didn't know what their rights were. And she kept saying, every sister should be taught about canon law. Every sister should be allowed to have some say over who the leadership was. None of this delegates to chapters business. And this letter went on and on and on and on. Now, the reason I gave you the example of the sisters of the School Sisters St. Francis and the Franciscan Sisters of Dubuque, Iowa, is on one level, they're kind of funny. And on the other level, I think it shows tremendous trust on the part of the sisters. All of these sisters were acting autonomously, who were School Sisters of St. Francis. And while Mother Alfond tried to control them, she only could do so to some extent. What impressed me about the story of Sister Egidia was that her response, which was really pretty mean-spirited toward the leadership of the community, was preserved along with the responses of all the other houses. She was an individual, but they took it, it was saved, and it's now preserved for posterity. And she had faith and trust that they would listen to her, even as she was complaining. I thought that was pretty remarkable, and it taught me an awful lot about community dynamics in early American religious life. For the most part, though, sisters' hostility was directed as much toward clerics as anyone else. On the left, we have a picture of Sister Augusta Anderson, who was a late 19th century superior of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the community whose mother house is across the road from the University of Notre Dame. Mother Augusta Anderson died in 1907, and she spent much of her her leadership fighting for papal recognition of her congregation to get them out from under the control of Father Edward Sorin, who was revered at the University of Notre Dame, if you've ever been there. Shortly before her death, she was talking to one of her sisters, and she said, the sister asked her what she regarded as her greatest accomplishment in leading the community. And she said, and this is a quote from an essay about her, biographical essay written by Sister Madaleva Wolf, who many of you have heard of. She was one of the pioneering sister educators in America. And Madaleva quoted Mother Augusta as saying, "I have asked God for only one thing. What I have had to suffer does not count. I have asked him to fix my sisters so that no man can ever lay his hand upon them. I asked nothing more, and he has done all that I asked." The other picture is of Margaret Anna Cusack, a convert from the Episcopal Church. She had been an Episcopal sister. Then she became a Poor Clare, and then she founded what is now known as the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. She brought the community to this country in the mid-1880s. And shortly after their arrival, after many run-ins with the bishops of New York and Newark, She not only left her congregation because she realized that her controversial personality was preventing them from being respected by the clerical hierarchy, but shortly thereafter, she would leave the Catholic Church, and she died as she was born, an Episcopalian, an Anglican. But as she wrote in the 1888 US edition of her memoirs, which was written after she left her order, but before she left Catholicism, she wrote, "The crushing hand of ecclesiastical despotism stifles every cry of suffering or complaint. I know that Roman Catholics will cry out with indignation and Protestants with amazement when I say that the sisterhoods in the Roman Catholic Church have often succeeded, not because of the help of the Church, but in the face of its determined and, I might say, often cruel opposition." Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peggy. Oh my gosh, you're right. You could go on and I would listen for hours and hours and hours. Thank you. That is just delightful, those stories. So we're going to open up for questions for a short period of time. So if you have a question, you can use the little reaction button and raise your hand, or you can raise it like this. Or if you want to, you can also just open your mic and I will see that you come to the top of the list and I'll call on you. So okay, Sue, Sue Rakowski. Oh my gosh. How are you? Welcome.
Hi, Sue.
Hi, Deborah. Thanks so much, Peggy. It was so fascinating. In your last slide with Mother Augusta,
yes.
When she wrote about, that Father Sorin would not lay his hands on them, did she mean this in terms of governance and oppression, or did she mean it in terms of sexual abuse?
She did not mean it in terms of sexual abuse, and thank you for clarifying that. What he had done was he had, even after they received papal approbation, he continued to act as their superior. In fact, he founded a second community of Sisters of the Holy Cross, whose purpose was to do housekeeping for the priests at Notre Dame. He admitted them, he formed them. It was totally unauthorized. And eventually, in order to rescue them, the real Sisters of the Holy Cross took these sisters in. But he was not talking about sexual abuse. She was not talking about sexual abuse. She was talking about authoritarian abuse. Mm-hmm. Thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you. And thank you for emphasizing commitment and agency earlier in your talk. You really illustrated that in these women's lives.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the main purposes of my research, is to allow their voices to be heard and allow their perspective to be expressed.
Great. Thank you, Sue. Ed Hart, you have a question.
Oh, when did the Irish start coming
I believe it's Ed Hart.
Ed Hart.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Professor Thompson, for your excellent discussion. I think that history is not very well known at all. I know a lot of that I had never heard of. My question has to do with your research and how you have found the archives open to you, are closed to you, are edited before you got there. I was able to hear Shannon D. Williams give a Zoom lecture in her research on Black sisters' experience, and she found that some of the orders that she wished to examine their history had expurged their records. And I was wondering what you had found in your research. Thank you.
That's a really good question. The answer is I really, there were a few communities that were not really welcoming. one of the problems, it's both a problem and an opportunity in dealing with private archives, is you're very dependent upon individuals. It's very different from doing research like in the Library of Congress or the National Archives or a state historical society. Also, I think I know Shannon and I know her research quite well. And I think a lot of her research is on sisters who are still living. And there are different rules that govern the records of people who are still alive. And so because my research stops really in 1917 or 1920, that was not an issue for me. And so if I was able to get into a congregation's archives, sisters were incredibly forthcoming and sometimes showed me things I wouldn't have known was there, often some very controversial stuff, because they just wanted to be open with me. So I had a very different experience from Shannon, but I think it's largely because all of my sisters are dead. And so the same rules don't govern the archives. I worked in about 6 archives, and I would say there were 3 that were problematic in terms of blocking access. And one time when I talked to a later archivist, she said, please come back. I'll let you look at anything we've got, and I haven't been able to do that, but I appreciated her welcome.
Thanks, Ed. Someone who's your name is Fire Tablet. So I'm not sure what your name is, but you can go ahead and ask your question.
Me? Mine?
Yeah, that's you.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, you haven't mentioned either the Irish sisters that came into California and and then a lot of other religious came in through Mexico through the 18th. I guess that would be in the 19th century, but. Or they in New Mexico, I think they came in the 16th century. Did you have any information about? I don't know where the religious sisters came in.
There weren't really any religious sisters who came that early into what is now the United States. I was dealing with what is now the United States, and so there are communities now that have come in through Mexico, but as far as I've been able to determine, there really were not women religious in those areas. If you know of any, I would love
to. Mexico, in the New Mexico, sisters didn't come in.
They came in from not from Mexico though. They came in from
Spain.
Like the Sisters of Loretto, the Cincinnati Charities, and others who were working in that area. But you're absolutely right that there are now a number of communities that have come in through Latin America.
I went to the Dominicans in San Rafael, and
yes,
they could come into Monterey, but I don't know with the mission. I'm just trying to.
They actually came from Ohio. Their founder came from Ohio.
In Monterey?
In San Rafael.
No, well, they first came to Monterey.
Well, the sisters of the Franciscan Sisters of San Rafael.
The Dominican sisters started in Monterey. Oh, they didn't come from Mexico.
No. That's what I'm trying to suggest.
Oh, I didn't think they came from there. Oh dear, and then the Irish. No, they didn't. They would have come in the 18th century. Yeah.
There were so many communities, and it's really hard to keep them all straight. So I mean,
I'm a West Coaster.
Great. Thank you very much for your questions. We appreciate that. Let's move to Anita. You have a question?
A comment and a question. History is so enlightening. And so when we do vocation work and parish work and talking about changes in religious life today, and being able to say, oftentimes it's been controversial. So we have to stand up for issues and pray and watch and see where the Spirit leads. My question is, with this excellent research that you've done, have you also done research in addition to how the women religious here in the U.S. have struggled at times with clergy? also with more of the things that they've accomplished. Like I heard in several about one sister being involved in the start of the Mayo Clinic and the ministering to the civil.
April 26th. That's in April 26th talk.
Okay. Thank you. I'll put it in my calendar. Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning that. Absolutely. And Sister, which CDP community are you from?
San Antonio.
Oh, your Mother St. Andrews family.
Mother St. Andrew, yes, definitely.
Okay.
Mother St.
Great.
Andrew.
Okay.
And
Great.
so to hear the parallels, thank you.
Thank you.
I love this. I can't wait till the next session. Yeah. So Sister Magdala Marie Gilbert, you have a question.
Oh, yeah. Yes. I didn't hear you mention anything about the Handmaids of Mary in New York.
Oh, I know the Handmaids of Mary. And the reason, Sister, is that I love the Handmaids of Mary. One of my dear friends on the faculty at Syracuse University, Arthur Paris, was educated by the Handmaids, and his mother worked with the Handmaids in Harlem. So the reason I haven't mentioned them is really because they were founded after 1917, when my research stops. But I do know their story, and it's a wonderful story.
Right.
Yes. And they're a great group of women. And I've just learned a little bit more about their early years and how, where they were originally founded from and their founder. It's a fascinating story. And I wish I could keep going because I would love to be able to include their story.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you.
I assume that's your story. I assume you're in that congregation, Sister? I think she silenced herself.
Yeah, she did. Okay, good. Well, thank you. So Bev, you have a question?
I think you're still on mute.
You'll need to unmute, Bev.
Okay, I'm from Australia, I'm still unmuted. Here I'm mute. I'm not muted anymore. That's actually what I would like to say is that I really do appreciate these series. I'm from Australia, and I'm with the Mary MacKillop St. Joseph Order.
Oh,
I'm on the covenant pathway, which is a married pathway. And prior to that, I've been, of course, married, 4 children, still married, and also a union organiser. And I think that with the Health Services Union, and I think that if more women, especially women who have been abandoned by their church because of all these issues that we've had around pedophilia and abuse and corruption and covering up, if it becomes more widely known that there are different pathways for women, I think that we can bring these women back in.
I really thank you for that. I'm an associate, which I think is a comparable type of membership with the Immaculate Heart of Mary Sisters in Monroe, Michigan. So
right.
I think we have something in common there. I think that's true. I would also say a larger thing here, which is that I've studied religious life in various parts of Europe, not to the same degree, obviously, as I have in the United States. And I've studied some in Canada. But I will say, I think the closest parallel to the US experience is the Australian experience.
Yeah, I think so.
A lot of parallels. And
yes.
So I've thoroughly enjoyed, and my dream someday, Bev, is to come to Australia.
Oh, you'd be very welcome.
And I'm saving my airline points and my money so I can do that. But
yeah, and New Zealand, of course, because we're Australia, New Zealand.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think
same experiences.
Thank you.
I think you're now muted.
Thank you very much. I think we just have time for one more question. We're running over already, but I think, and I'm not sure if this is Joanne, you have your mic turned off. Yes, so maybe you have a question, and that'll be the last question for tonight.
In your book, do you have the the name or the area where the precious blood priests were coming from?
The precious blood priests that I'm talking about in the story of the Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon were the ones in Ohio, the original group that came over. And, they were working with Mother Brunner sisters and so forth. And some of these women are you a member of that community, or do you know that community?
Not that one. I'm from O'Fallon, Missouri.
Oh, okay. No, this is the
We're part of the same trunk, but
exactly
different branches.
This is the Ohio CPPS group. And I know your history too, and it's fascinating. And trust me, you'll be in the book. You'll be in the book. But
good.
What I'm doing too is I am putting my email address in the chat, and I do hope that people will come to the talk on April 26th. But if you do have questions, or if you want to send me some interesting stuff about your community's history, if you're a sister, my email is always available to you. Believe me.
That's great.
I mean, I'm being a little selfish here, but.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Joanne, for your question. And Peggy, thank you for, wow, just a fabulous evening. It's been great.